Today, Havana Syndrome remains one of the most disturbing mysteries of the modern era. Was it a secret weapon wielded by America's enemies, a shadow program born from its own laboratories, or something stranger, beyond human understanding, using sound and energy in ways science has yet to grasp? For the victims, the debate is irrelevant. They live with the consequences every day. But for the rest of us, Havana Syndrome is a warning. The future of warfare may not be fought with tanks or missiles, but with unseen forces that can fracture the mind, break the body, and leave no trace behind. And when that war begins, we may never even know we've been attacked. By 2023, after years of investigation, the intelligence community released a statement that stunned many. They could not find definitive evidence that Havana Syndrome was caused by a foreign adversary. To victims, it felt like betrayal, as though their suffering had been erased with a single bureaucratic shrug. But behind closed doors, some officials admitted the truth was far murkier. Classified reports hinted at experimental technologies, unexplained anomalies, and incidents that could not be reconciled with conventional science. The official denial left a chilling gap. Either the US was covering up a vulnerability too grave to admit, or the phenomenon was so advanced that even the most powerful nation on Earth couldn't explain it. In parallel, allies began reporting suspicious incidents as well. Canadian diplomats in Havana experienced the same piercing sounds and neurological symptoms. German officials quietly filed similar complaints. Even officers from nations that were not direct US allies whispered of invisible attacks during overseas missions. The phenomenon was spreading, and with it, the realization that this was not an isolated American issue. If a new class of weapon had truly emerged, then the global order was at risk. Traditional treaties and defenses were powerless against something that left no trace, no evidence, and no clear perpetrator. The battlefield was now the human mind itself. As pressure mounted, whispers spread inside the intelligence community that perhaps the truth was too dangerous to reveal. What if the weapon wasn't foreign at all? A few insiders hinted at classified US experiments dating back to the Cold War, projects buried under layers of secrecy. Programs like McUltra and acoustic warfare tests were quietly mentioned in closed circles. Could Havana Syndrome be the ghost of America's own research, resurfacing decades later in the hands of unknown actors? For the victims, this possibility was even more horrifying. It meant their suffering might not be the result of foreign aggression, but of their own government's unfinished experiments coming back to haunt them. Congress responded by passing emergency measures, authorizing funding for medical care and compensation for those afflicted. But money couldn't buy clarity. Doctors treating the victims admitted they were working blind, relying on guesswork rather than proven science. Some neurologists warned that the injuries resembled those from traumatic brain impacts, yet victims had never been struck. Others compared the scans to radiation damage. Every theory raised new questions without closing old ones. Meanwhile, victims continued to suffer in silence, struggling to perform basic tasks, their careers and identities slipping away. The syndrome was no longer just a security issue. It had become a humanitarian crisis unfolding in the shadows of geopolitics. By 2021, the crisis could no longer be hidden from the public. Journalists began piecing together leaks from intelligence insiders, publishing exposes that described the growing list of victims and the mounting fear inside US agencies. The phrase Havana Syndrome exploded into mainstream media, capturing global attention. Yet the more it was discussed, the more confusing it became. Politicians demanded answers, victims begged for recognition, and adversarial nations mocked the United States, claiming it was inventing excuses for its failures abroad. For ordinary citizens, the idea that invisible weapons could target officials anywhere in the world blurred the line between conspiracy theory and reality. feeding both fear and disbelief. Some within the Pentagon grew convinced the attacks were not just about espionage, but domination. If an adversary possessed a weapon that could disable diplomats and operatives at will, then no negotiation, no mission, no operation was safe. America's enemies wouldn't need to fire missiles or send soldiers. They could cripple US influence by disabling the very people meant to carry its message abroad. To combat this, experimental countermeasures were tested: shielding in embassies, sound frequency jammers, even portable scanners. But results were inconsistent, and often, by the time symptoms appeared, it was already too late. The invisible war was moving faster than the defenses meant to stop it. Behind closed doors, the CIA launched one of its largest internal investigations in decades. Dozens of officers were interviewed, their missions retraced, their communications scrutinized. Patterns began to surface: strange vans parked near embassies, unidentified individuals loitering near hotels, sudden disruptions in electronic equipment just before symptoms appeared. A few officers swore they saw flashes of light or felt an intense beam of heat moments before collapsing. These fragments were never enough to form conclusive proof, but together they painted a terrifying picture: a weapon capable of striking silently, leaving no trace but shattered minds and broken lives. The question remained: who had the power to wield such a tool? Still, skeptics remained. Some scientists insisted the syndrome could be explained by mass psychogenic illness, a kind of collective stress reaction magnified by paranoia and fear. They pointed to the absence of hard forensic evidence and argued that the brain injuries were inconsistent, varying too much from one victim to another. But to the men and women who suffered daily from debilitating symptoms, such explanations felt like an insult. "We know what we experienced," one CIA officer said bitterly, "and we know someone did this to us." The debate only widened the divide between victims, desperate for answers, and officials, reluctant to admit the US might be under attack by an invisible weapon it couldn't stop. As investigations dragged on, a chilling pattern emerged. The attacks often preceded critical diplomatic negotiations. Before US Cuba talks, agents fell ill in Havana. Prior to a NATO summit, European staff reported strange symptoms in their hotel rooms. Before meetings in Asia, American operatives collapsed with migraines and disorientation. To those watching closely, it looked less like random incidents and more like a carefully orchestrated campaign, a way to disrupt diplomacy by targeting the very people who carried it out. If true, Havana Syndrome wasn't simply a weapon, it was psychological warfare at the highest level, a silent assault designed to weaken America's influence without firing a single shot. Inside the Pentagon, frustration turned to fear. How do you defend against a weapon you cannot see? How do you deter an attack when you can't prove who carried it out? Task forces were established, medical teams deployed, and intelligence committees convened, but answers remained out of reach. Victims demanded accountability, and allies asked uncomfortable questions about whether American power was slipping. Some within the intelligence community began to whisper that Havana Syndrome wasn't just a health crisis, it was a signal, a message from the shadows, reminding the US that even its most guarded agents could be reached, and that the balance of global power was far more fragile than the public was allowed to believe. Theories multiplied, but one name kept resurfacing: Russia. Intelligence analysts recalled decades of Soviet research into psychotronic weapons and microwave technology designed to disrupt human behavior. During the Cold War, there had been reports of mysterious Moscow signals directed at the US Embassy in Russia as far back as the 1970s. Could Havana Syndrome be the modern evolution of that old playbook? Others argued it was China, experimenting on US personnel in regions where spheres of influence clashed. But in classified briefings, some experts warned against pointing fingers too quickly. The precision, the secrecy, and the way attacks seemed to anticipate US movements suggested a highly sophisticated adversary, perhaps one with resources beyond any government. Meanwhile, victims were quietly suffering. Diplomats, once at the height of their careers, now struggled to read, to walk steadily, to remember simple tasks. Families were torn apart as spouses and children watched loved ones decline without explanation or justice. Some intelligence officers confided that they felt discarded, abandoned by the very agencies they served. Lawsuits piled up, demanding compensation and recognition, while Congress pressured intelligence officials for answers. Still, the truth remained elusive. Was this a global campaign by America's adversaries, an experimental weapon out of control, or perhaps even something more unsettling? An unknown force, not bound by any nation. The possibilities only deepen the sense of dread. By 2019, the mystery had reached the very heart of US power. A senior White House official was suddenly stricken while walking near the ellipse, just outside the president's residence. She reported dizziness, confusion, and a piercing sound that no one else could hear. The proximity to the Oval Office was a terrifying escalation. If someone could strike in the most secure area of Washington, nowhere was safe. Secret Service officers began reviewing surveillance footage, but no clear suspect emerged. The event shook confidence inside the government, and whispers grew louder that the syndrome was more than a medical puzzle. It was an act of war, carried out in the shadows, leaving no fingerprints, but devastating effects. At the same time, scientific theories multiplied. Some argued the cause was microwave radiation, not sound, capable of heating tissue deep inside the skull. Others pointed to directed energy weapons, devices that could focus invisible beams across long distances, designed for espionage and sabotage. In 2018, a secret Pentagon study described neurological effects consistent with electromagnetic exposure, fueling suspicions that Havana Syndrome was not a mystery at all, but the deliberate use of classified technology. Yet officials walked a fine line. Admitting too much would reveal America's own experiments, while admitting too little risked leaving its people defenseless. The result was silence, confusion, and more victims left searching for answers. Soon, new incidents were reported far beyond Cuba. American officials in China, Germany, Austria, even Washington itself began describing the same strange attacks. The pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. In Vienna, more than 20 US personnel fell ill in a single year, raising alarms that America's adversaries might be targeting key intelligence hubs. Reports suggested that officers engaged in counterintelligence or sensitive negotiations were often the ones struck, as if someone was deliberately selecting high-value targets. The chilling implication was clear. This wasn't random. It was a campaign. And the question everyone feared to ask out loud was, who was behind it? Russia, China, or perhaps a power hidden deeper in the shadows, operating outside the public eye? The most disturbing aspect was the secrecy. Victims reported being silenced or pressured not to speak publicly. Official statements from Washington were vague, sometimes contradictory. Was this deliberate cover-up, or genuine confusion at the top levels of government? Leaked documents suggested the Pentagon and intelligence agencies were already experimenting with acoustic influence technologies decades earlier. Files spoke of weapons that could disorient, cause pain, or even manipulate emotions using nothing more than sound waves. Could Havana have been the testing ground for something far larger? Was this a glimpse into a hidden battlefield where wars are fought not with bullets or bombs, but with frequencies aimed directly at the human mind? As the cases multiplied, the story exploded in the media. Suddenly, Havana Syndrome became a global headline. Families of diplomats spoke of ruined lives. Once healthy individuals now suffered chronic dizziness, memory loss, and concentration problems. Some could no longer work, yet skeptics argued the phenomenon might be psychosomatic, stress and paranoia feeding into physical symptoms. But others pointed to the chilling consistency of the accounts, dozens of people, across different locations, describing nearly identical sensations. If it was a weapon, it was precise, invisible, and terrifying. Intelligence insiders whispered that only a handful of nations had the capability to design such a device, suggesting a shadow war was playing out in plain sight. Investigations by the CIA and FBI only deepened the mystery. Confidential reports discussed the possibility of directed microwave or ultrasonic devices capable of targeting the human brain. Such technology wasn't entirely science fiction. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States experimented with sound and radio waves as potential weapons. Yet in Cuba, the events felt like those old legends reborn in modern reality. Victims claimed they heard the strange noises even through walls, sometimes at night, when silence should have surrounded them. Some described the effect as if their heads were trapped inside an invisible chamber of vibrations. The US government took the threat seriously, evacuating staff and escalating tensions with Havana. In late 2016, American diplomats stationed in Cuba began to report strange and disturbing symptoms. They suffered from headaches, nausea, hearing loss, and a sensation of pressure inside their skulls. But the strangest detail was the sound. Many described hearing mysterious high-pitched noises, buzzing, grinding, or vibrations, as if coming from nowhere. These incidents would later be known as the Havana Syndrome. Doctors were baffled. There was no virus, no bacteria, no trace of chemical poisoning. Everything pointed towards something invisible, something technological. Rumors of a secret sonic weapon quickly spread. Could the Cuban government or another hidden power have used advanced technology to attack US diplomats? Or was it all just a case of mass psychogenic illness, a mystery of the human mind amplified by fear?